Thank you, Eric. My name is Sarah Darren. I am a senior consultant here at Business Forecast Systems. We are a firm located just outside of Boston, and we develop and market the ForecasPRO product line. As you can see here, I have a pretty lengthy history of working with statistical and forecasting models. Before coming to Business Forecast Systems, I was a vice president at Nielsen, where I worked in the customized modeling group, working with data from a wide array of industries, really. So both the Nielsen POS data as well as customers' own sales data, which, as many as you know, is always very messy and fun. As you probably can guess, while I was there, I had to deal a lot with price and promotion events for our clients. So it's certainly something that I've had a lot of experience with, and I hope that will show. So here's a quick roadmap of what we'll be covering today. We're going to start off talking a little bit about the evolution of the forecasting process and where event modeling fits in there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what events are, some different ways that we might address forecasting event-driven data, and really the crux of this webinar is going to be going through some real data examples, which hopefully will really help you to understand how useful event index models can be for you. A quick summary, and then as Eric said, we'll have a chance to do some Q&A at the end. So let's start by thinking about how a company's forecasting process evolves. Very often, we can see a real progression of sophistication as this process matures. So in the beginning, people very frequently start off managing their forecast process in Excel. So a very common thing to do is to do a same as last year model. So basically look at what happened last year in the same month and adjust it for some percentage, whether you're trending up or down. This is a pretty good starting point. It's certainly better than not having a forecast process ready to go, but it can reach its limitations pretty quickly. First and foremost, the forecasts do not tend to be particularly accurate. It can also become very difficult to maintain a forecasting process in Excel, especially if you have a lot of different items that you're managing and you have a fairly complex hierarchy for those items. Excel can become error prone pretty quickly, very easy to make mistakes. So Excel-based forecasting processes very often start to fall under their own weight. So typically, a lot of people will find that moving to this next phase of automatic time series approaches can be really helpful. This is going from Excel to an automated time series approach. There's really a lot of advantage to gain. So time series approaches use demand history to extrapolate forward trends and seasonal patterns, so projecting it forward. Doing this, this automated approach really generates much more accurate forecasts and typically provides ways for organizing the data much better. So a quick example, just to show how straightforward this can be, going to our ForecasPRO track product here. Here, auto parts, all we have is historic demand here with a click of a button and a wait of about 2 seconds. We have automated forecasts for all of these items, and they're all organized into this nice hierarchy out here. So if we open up the graph here, you can see that there's a forecast now just automatically generated for every item. So that's nice and quick and easy, and much easier than doing that in Excel. So a lot to be gained from that automatic time series approach, but you might still find that there are certain types of data where this automatic approach doesn't work well. Some data demands a more custom approach. Some examples of this might be new products with limited or no demand history, promoted products, clearly one of the very a big topic of today. And there also might be products that are driven very much by some external factor. So economy, temperature. A good example of this might be electrical usage, where understanding the temperature patterns is very important to being able to accurately forecast electricity usage. So overall, the message here is that automatic approaches can only take you so far. There's always going to be a subset of cases where adopting a customized approach is going to help you squeeze out a little bit more accuracy from your forecasting process. So let's take a look at some of the customized forecasting methods that you might consider. Obviously, event index models is one of these customized approaches and the topic of today's webinar. There are other customized approaches that are definitely going to help you with improving forecasting accuracy. Hierarchical approaches, so top-down or middle-out allocation schemes. Typically, forecasting at a higher level in the hierarchy can really improve accuracy overall. Dynamic regression, again, that goes back to the temperature and electricity example. So lots of different things. The one thing that all these approaches have in common is that they all require a little more time from the forecaster. So whereas the automatic approach is exactly that, customized approaches require that more decisions be made. You need to give information to the software or the algorithm. So again, this is a continuous improvement, and after you're comfortable with the automatic approach, exploring some of these customized approaches is really a great way to squeeze out some more accuracy from your process. So let's talk about events a little now. What is an event? Well, events are things that can occur that have a significant impact on your demand, but they cannot be predicted from past history, which is exactly what an automatic approach would do. So here are some examples of events. Product promotions, a very common example. We run promotions, they impact your demand, and we have knowledge of when they're going to happen in the future. When these promotions may happen in the future is typically not something that can be extrapolated from past history. Sometimes it can. If there's always a January sale and we are forecasting monthly data, we may be able to rely on seasonality to capture that January impact. So extrapolating out January's will actually capture the impact of that January sale. But typically, we don't know when promotions will happen based solely on when they've happened in the past. And in those cases, events are going to come in handy. Movable holidays. Holidays are another good example of events that you might want to consider. So Easter might happen in March in one year, in January, or rather in April the next year. Actually, one of the first projects I did out of grad school was forecast sales for imitation crab, which, as you know, I didn't know that much about the product, but as I learned, is very much driven by Lent. So Lent imitation crab sales just really spike up during Lent. So understanding the timing of Lent was really critical for accurately forecasting imitation crab sales, as it turned out. And Lent is, you know, as you know, something that definitely moves a lot from one year to the next. So good example of that. Catastrophes, earthquakes, hurricanes, terrorist events. These are all things that we've seen way too much of in the last 6 months. But they can have a really big impact on your sales. So suppose we have a production facility in Puerto Rico or Santa Rosa, California. We're not going to be able to produce enough product. So we're likely to see a dip in sales because we can't produce enough product. Catastrophic events can also have a positive impact as well. So an example of that might be electrical generator sales. So you have a weather-related event, lots of people lose their electricity, they go out, they buy generators, you're going to see a spike in generator sales around an event like that. And that's, in general, that's true of all of the events that we're talking about, that there can be a positive impact or a negative impact, so a spike or a dip. And in either case, we might want to consider those events in an event index model. So here are a few other possible examples of events. This is not a comprehensive list by any means. Again, anything, an event can be anything that can occur that has a significant impact on your demand, where accommodating it in your model is going to improve your forecast. Okay, so what do we do if we do have events? How do we handle that data? Well, there are a bunch of different things we could do. One of them is judgmentally adjust the data to remove the impact. So essentially rewrite the demand history. We've probably all seen this done, and it's definitely not a best practice. Essentially, there's no right way to be adjusting the data history. Doing something like this is highly judgmental, and it introduces a lot of noise into your process, and it's difficult to maintain a real and revised data history. There's a need for documentation, so it gets messy really quickly. Another thing that you could potentially try doing is separate base demand from event-driven demand. So basically separate out two different data streams. Now this can be done if you really understand the two data streams and those data streams are relatively independent. So one data stream does not influence the other. So for example, if you have one customer that is running a promotion and one that is not for a given item, you can certainly isolate the impact of the promotion by looking at only the customer that was running the promotion. So in that case, you can easily separate out by customer. But more often than not, it's actually quite difficult to do. So if you're familiar with scanner data, you may know that both IRI and Nielsen use something called baselining to separate base and promotional demand. Really, the goal of this is to estimate how much would have been sold in the absence of a promotion. And this actually does work quite well, but it involves an intricate algorithm that requires regular calibration. So this can also be, in many cases, even more difficult and less accurate than using a modeling approach, which brings us to our highly recommended modeling approaches, of which there are many you can consider. Event index models are certainly a very good one, but they're not the only one. There are REMA intervention models. You can also use multivariate models with dummy variables to control for events. But event models are certainly a very good and straightforward approach, and are a solid way to address this. So what is an event index model? Well, it's an extension of exponential smoothing. I expect that many of you who are listening are very familiar with exponential smoothing models. They're certainly very frequently popping up in automatic algorithms, certainly in the ForecasPRO ones. The idea behind exponential smoothing is that historic data is made up of data components, so level, seasonality, and trend. Exponential smoothing estimates these components in the historic data and forecasts by extrapolating them into the future. With an event index model, we're introducing a fourth component. This fourth component is an index-based approach. So this is very similar. The way we handle events in an event index model is very similar to how seasonality is handled in an exponential smoothing model with an index. And as a quick example of some of these indexes, I'm going to jump back to our example here, our auto parts. And so what we have here is a multiplicative Winters exponential smoothing model. And at the bottom, you can see these seasonal indexes that come out of it. So the idea of the seasonal indexes is that in a given month, we are adjusting the forecast up or down according to what month it is. So for example, our highest seasonal index here is this 1.74 essentially in September. So that means in September, what we're going to do is we're going to increase sales 74% over what the average level is. Or in January, where we have our lowest index, about 0.5, we're going to adjust sales down by about 50%. And the event approach is very similar. So the idea is that when the event happens, we're going to adjust it up according to an index or adjust it down according to an index, depending on whether it's a positive or negative impact from that event. So very similar to the way seasonal indexes are working in an exponential smoothing model. So as we mentioned, the event component is a fourth component to an exponential smoothing model, which means that we're also introducing additional smoothing weights and updating equations. We're not going to go into a lot of details about how these equations work here, but if you want details on any of this, feel free to reach out with us and we'd be happy to send you some more details. So another key part of a event index model is an event schedule. So the model requires an event schedule. As we talked about earlier, an event index model is a customized approach, which means it involves a bit more work than an automated model. In this case, creating the event schedule really is the bulk of that work. What an event schedule does is it's essentially a record of when things have happened historically and when you expect them to happen in the future. So in addition to maintaining a demand history, you also need to maintain a record of when your events are have happened and when you expect them to be happening in the future. So on this simple example here, it's as simple as, January, nothing happened. February, there was a price promotion, etc. And really this concept of event schedules will be clear as we get to the examples. And this is the point where we're going to start in with some examples. We're going to start off with a very simple example and get progressively more difficult as we move forward. So here's some data. This is a product that is sold via home parties. So companies like Tupperware, Mary Kay are some of the really traditional companies that do this. These days you see a lot of clothing and jewelry lines pop up on social media sites and so on, being sold in a similar way. But the general idea that is someone hosts a party and displays whatever products are selling for sale. Often guests will receive a free gift as an incentive to come to the party. So this product is sold through that party channel, so to speak. So when we look at this data, the first thing that we really see is, well, this huge spike right here. In this January 2017, we see sales going up to over 25,000, where traditionally they've been more at this 5,000 level. So we're seeing sales 400% higher than usual. It's also worth noting that in the previous January, so January 2016 and this one back here, we didn't see a spike like that. So it does not seem to be a seasonal spike. Something happened here to really make demand spike. If we look at December, we can see that at this point sales were a little bit under 9,000. So again, significantly higher than what we've seen historically, and a lot higher than the other Decembers in our demand history, which both are just slightly over 5,000. So it looks like something happened there. So we have two periods with highly elevated sales. So what happened? Well, the answer is that this product was the free gift that the guests received at these sales parties. So when we look at sales in January, this is actually a combination of the giveaway products and the actual for money sales of the product. If we think back to the different ways of handling event data, one of the approaches that we listed was to simply separate out the two data streams, if that's possible. In this case, if we tried separating out the two streams, so if we had the free gifts and the paid for sales, we would end up seeing a dip in the paid for sales right around this promotion. The fact that we gave away the product changes our demand for the paid for product, because the free gifts are subsidizing people who would have paid for the product instead but didn't have to. So in this case, there's no easy way to separate out these two data streams, which makes event models quite appropriate in this case. So before we start looking at event models, let's take a look at what happens with the automatic approach. So for that, I'm going to turn on forecasts and I'm going to turn on the fitted values. So here's what we get. And there are clearly some issues. We are completely missing the January spike and the December spike here. In addition, in the forecast period, we have this spike in January. So what's happening here is the automatic approach is assuming that this January spike is due to seasonality, and we're extrapolating forward this new January seasonality into the forecast period. So is this a good forecast? Well, probably not. Really, there are two scenarios that could be happening here. Either the free giveaway is going to happen again, in which case we would expect the forecast to be up here, or it's not going to happen and we would expect the forecast to be down here. So in neither of those scenarios would we expect the forecast to be in this mid-range so that we're seeing here. So you really need some knowledge about the data to come up with a good model. And let's now look at what happens when we do an event model. So I'm going to right-click on the context menu here and go to Manage Events. So to set up an event schedule, one of the things we need to think about is how many events we need and when the different types of events occurred. In this example, we could do a one-size-fits-all approach and have one event for both the January and the December. But the scale of the December and January spikes is really very different. January was a 400% increase, while December was, slightly under 100% increase. So very different. And as it turns out, the giveaway actually started partially through December. So it makes sense that the December spike is much lower than the January. The promotion was not running for the whole month. So in this case, it makes sense to use two different event types for the December and the January time periods. So that is what we have done. We have two event types in here, and I'm going to go, and for the January, I'm going to assign the full giveaway event, and for the December, I will assign the partial month giveaway event. I will hit commit, and so this is what we got, and you can see that we are now capturing the spikes in the January and in December, but moreover, we're not seeing that kind of mid-level spike that we had in January earlier. And when we set up that event schedule, you'll note that we did not put any event on this January time period. So we were assuming that that there would not be another a giveaway. And when we looked at the automatic method, this is more the level that we would expect for that no giveaway this month scenario. If in fact we discovered there is going to be an event, I'm going to go to manage events here, we could actually assign that event, and then we would now see this spike at that level for that other scenario, the giveaway scenario, happening again. So again, if that was going to happen, this is now a sensible forecast for that particular scenario. So this is a very simple example, but this is a fairly common scenario, and event models are a good way to address this scenario. So let's jump back to the slides for briefly. And so let's just talk a little bit more about what we need to consider when we're building an event model. So one of the things that we had to do is decide how many event types we were going to use. In the case of this giveaway example, it made sense to use two event types because the size of the spikes were very different, and there was a logical reason why they were very different. In general, we want to use as few event types as possible while still accommodating real differences. In this case, there was a real difference between the January and December, so we really did need two event types. But in general, simplicity is a great approach to modeling, and you do want to make it as simple as possible, and that is typically going to give you more stable, more accurate forecasts. Another important consideration when building an event index model, each event type needs to have happened historically. The only way to extrapolate from the past into the future is to have seen it in the past. If there's a new promotion planned in the forecast period, so something that you've never run before, there are still a few things that you can do. A reasonable approach would be to assume that the planned promotion will behave similarly to promotion that has occurred in the past and leverage that event type in the forecast. Once the planned promotion does actually occur, you can then assign a unique event type and have a better basis for forecasting that new promotion that's been introduced going forward. The other critical component of building an event model is having that schedule include both the history and the forecast periods. So again, in the giveaway example, we saw how drastically different the forecast is depending on whether the giveaway is happening in January of the forecast period or not. So getting that schedule right is And knowing that schedule is going to be a really important component of improving the forecast accuracy. So let's go to another little more complicated example. So what we're looking at here is sales of mouthwash. So we have two different sizes here, 24 ounce and 32 ounce. We're going to focus on the 24 ounce right now. When we look at this data, the first thing that we really notice is that there are a lot of big spikes throughout this data. So let's look at when some of these spikes are happening. So we have January, May, October, January, May, October, January, May, July, October. So overall, the spikes seem to fall within the same months in general, but not always. So a natural question to ask here is, what is driving these spikes? Are they seasonal? They seem to be. Well, this is mouthwash. So people are going to use it pretty consistently throughout the year, and we definitely don't expect it to be seasonal. So while it looks like May and October and so on are just great months for a mouthwash demand, it's not really being driven by seasonality. The spikes are being driven by price promotions. So let's take a look at what happens with the automatic forecast approach. And again, I will put in forecast and I will put in fitted. So overall, this historic fit is not looking really great. We have periods like this here where we are putting in a spike that didn't occur. You have other periods like right here where there's a spike that occurred that we're completely missing. We also see a lot of spikes in the forecast period rather. So these spikes here are all within the forecast period are all driven by really an assumed underlying seasonality that does not really exist. So what's happening here is that the software program is looking at the data and determining that it is seasonal, and statistically it probably is seasonal. And then it's extrapolating forward these seasonal spikes. So this is reasonable sometimes, but not right in this case because the spikes are promotion driven, not seasonal driven. So in this case, sorry about that. So in this case, the promotions are occurring in the same month very frequently, but not always. In some cases, if they were always going to be in the same month and they were going to be the same month for the foreseeable future, a seasonal model might be helpful. But in this case, we're actually seeing shifts. So in terms of making sure that we have a good forecast, we really need to make sure we understand when the promotions are really planned in the forecast period. So we need a schedule. And in this case, we have already set up a schedule and read it in with our data manager. It's called price specials. And so what we have in this price schedule is really, we have two different types of events. So these spikes here are all associated with promotion events. And if you look at the data though, and it's harder to see this at first sight because the spikes are so overwhelming, but you also have a lot of these visible dips happening. So like right here, and so on. what's happening here is competitors are running promotions. And that is also something that we understand when that has happened historically. And we also have a pretty good understanding of when competitors are going to be running those promotions in the future. So there are really two different types of events that we want to be accommodating in this event schedule. So we have that schedule all set up already, and we hit commit. And what we can see now is we're doing a much better job of tracking the historic data. So some of the misses that we saw earlier, this one here was a good example, we're now capturing that with this event model. And we can also see that we're doing a better job in the forecast period. So we have these spikes, and we know that they're happening when we have a planned promotion, and we have these dips, and we know that these are happening when a competitor is expected to have a planned promotion. Otherwise, the forecasts are pretty flat, which makes sense since the data is not really trended. Now, one of the things that people all frequently comment on is that the spikes in this forecast period seem small relative to many of these historic spikes. And that's certainly true. But if you look towards the end of the data here, you see that the spikes were getting smaller in the last year of the historic demand. So an event index model is an extension of an exponential smoothing model. And one of the key things about exponential smoothing is that it adapts. So it puts more emphasis on recent history, so here than here. So it's able to pick up on the fact that the spikes and therefore the promotional sensitivity has declined, and we're extrapolating forward the fact that the recent decline in promotional sensitivity is expected to continue forward. So that would seem to make these good forecasts. So that is our second example, and let's move back to the slide set quickly here, hopefully with no pop-up interruptions. And we're going to talk about weekly data a little bit. So weekly data is harder to forecast than monthly data. It tends to be really noisy, and there's also a lot of promotions in weekly data frequently, so you end up having a lot of events when you're using weekly data. Weekly seasonality can also really complicate a model since there are 52 seasonal indexes to measure. But some of the more particular challenges of weekly data, the number of weeks in a year can be either 52 or 53. This can certainly cause problems. There are more movable holidays than what you have with monthly data. So while holidays certainly can move with monthly data, it does tend to be more stable. So yes, Easter can certainly move in monthly data, but the 4th of July is always in July. With weekly data, the 4th of July might not always be in the same week of the year. There's also an issue with continuity between periods from year to year. So while there's a lot of similarity in a March from one year to the next, there's not a whole lot of continuity from week 17 from one year to the next. The weekly data has a lot more noise in it that is getting in the way of that continuity. So if you can get away with working with monthly data, that's great, and you should do that. But frequently, you're going to need a weekly forecast, or it might be the case that your events are planned and changed on a weekly basis, and that means that you're going to have to be working with weekly data. So let's look at an example of event models for weekly data. And this actually is one of my favorite examples because what we're looking at here is weekly sales of beer. So kind of a fun example. We have 2 different items here. So we have 6-pack cans and we have 12-pack cans. As I go between those 2, you can see that the 6-pack cans are declining, 12-pack cans are increasing. Overall, things are pretty flat. So pretty much people are buying more 12-packs than 6-packs, but overall beer consumption is pretty consistent over this time period. The other thing that you can, if we look at the data here, it's definitely very seasonal. So as we start off in January, in the winter, sales are low. Go into the summer, we see sales building up. And then as we move out of the summer back into the winter, sales fall down. So a very distinct seasonal pattern throughout this data stream. The other thing that really stands out is these spikes here. So within the summer, we have these 3 weeks each summer that are particularly big spikes. And these are all holiday driven. So we have Memorial Day, we have the 4th of July, and we have Labor Day. So, you know, this makes a lot of sense. During these long holiday weekends, people have a lot of cookouts and they drink a lot of beer. But this is an example of the movable holiday issue. So the 4th of July, while it is in week 27 here, as we move forward, it's actually in week 28. So it's not completely consistent when this holiday week is occurring. So let's go ahead and do our automatic forecast here. So we'll add in forecast and fitted to see how well we're doing. At first glance, it looks like this isn't doing a bad job, but it's weekly data and it's hard to see exactly what's going on here. So let's actually zoom in. And once we zoom in, we start to see that there are some problems. So the first right here, and this would be the Memorial Day spike, I believe, we're actually predicting that it happens a week earlier than it actually did. So we're getting when we expect that spike to occur wrong. And if we scroll through this a little more, you're going to see a few other misses based on that. So here's a good example here, the 4th of July spike not being quite captured. So this is a case where we're going to do a much better job if we actually use an event model and let the program know exactly when these holidays are really occurring. So let's go ahead and do that. And we have this holiday schedule here, and you can see that this schedule includes Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day through the forecast period. And let's hit commit and exit. And I'm going to go actually back down here. And you can see that we're actually not quite getting that right now. Let me actually go to the can 6 here, and I'm going to apply it here. And there we go. Okay. So now we can see that we are actually getting this 4th of July correctly with this event schedule applied. So one of the other things that we frequently see with these seasonal models is, if I go to the forecast period here, if I go down, I had mentioned before the issues with having a lot of seasonal indexes in these models. And when we look at this forecast report here, you can see that we're generating 52 weekly seasonal indexes in addition to the 3 holiday indexes that we have. This is really complex, and it's probably over specifying the seasonal patterns. So when we have weekly data and we're using event models, it's often going to make sense to use something called seasonal simplification. So let's take a look. I'm going to close this quickly. Let's take a look at this event schedule here to see how that can work. So what you see here is a step function of sorts with spikes in it. So what we're doing is we're assigning an event type to the first 4 weeks of the year, so essentially the January time period, another event to the next 4 weeks of the year, and we're cycling that through the 13 different 4 weeks units within the year while still maintaining these holiday spikes. So I'm going to go back here, and we are going to quickly switch from the holidays to this P&H schedule here. I'm going to hit commit. And wait for those results to come back. Exit. And I'm going to open up the forecast here, and what you'll see is if I go up to the top of the forecast, the base model, we're no longer doing seasonality within the base model. We have a simple exponential smoothing model, and all of the seasonality is being captured by event codes. So this event code of just under 0.71 means that in the first 4 weeks of the year, because of seasonality, we expect sales to be about 29% lower than the rest of the year. So this can be really helpful when you're working with weekly data because it does help you to simplify the model. So let's jump back to the slides yet again, and we're ready to summarize this a little bit. So first key point, time series methods do not perform well always in the presence of events. When things are moving around the calendar, when there are business interruptions, you're likely to find that automatic methods don't work well for all items. It might work well for some items, but there is likely to be a few items that you need to adopt a more customized approach, like an event model. An event index model can be a very effective way to forecast event-driven data. Through those examples, you certainly saw that we were doing a better job of forecasting once we made that step of moving from an automatic time series approach to an event index model. In terms of strengths of event index models, they really do a lot to improve forecasting accuracy for items that are event-driven. They're easy to apply, so there is some work involved, but that work is mostly straightforward in terms of deciding how many event types you want and putting together that event schedule. And they're really adaptable to changing dynamics, and that's what we saw in that mouthwash example where the model was able to pick up that decline in promotion sensitivity that had occurred historically. And our last example with weekly data really demonstrates that they can be very useful when forecasting weekly data, and in particular using seasonal simplification to really create what is likely to be a more stable forecast and accurate forecasting model. So with that, before we jump into questions, just a reminder that today's webinar will be available on our website. We will let you know when that has been posted. And when you go to our website, all previous webinars, we do these on a quarterly basis, have been archived. They're really helpful and informative. We certainly encourage you to make use of that resource. In terms of the software, the product that I was using today was ForecasPRO Track version 5, something that we just recently released last month. So we encourage you to take a look at that. And if you're interested in looking at a demo of the product, we do live WebEx demos. You can send us your own data and we can put that together for you. So if you're interested in that, you can, submit it as a question right now, visit our website, go into a chat with us, give us a call, email us, however you would like to contact us, we would love to hear from you. And we also, just a quick reminder before we jump to questions, we also do training and workshops. So in terms of the training, we do both on-site and remote-based. So again, just reach out to us on the website or via email if that's something that you're interested in. In terms of the seminars, we do expect to have a few of these next year. They're not posted yet. We expect them to be posted soon, and we encourage you to keep an eye on the website for upcoming events like that. And so with that, I'm hoping we have a little bit of time for some questions.
All right. Got a bunch of questions that have come in. We'll start with kind of a fundamental one about data and how that might affect event schedules. As we know, the demand history could be a bunch of different things. It could be sales or shipments or orders or point of sale and so on. How might the kind of demand data that we're using affect the event schedules that we're working with, or how we might think about the events we're creating?
Well, I think that when we think about events, the most important thing that you want to do first is to actually look at your data and see when the spikes are occurring. So I think it's certainly relevant in terms of, there is going to be, timing issues as to when a certain event is going to impact shipments versus sales or something like that. So, so that is certainly to be considered. But I think the important thing to do is whatever data stream you have, look at the data, identify when you see those spikes that could potentially be events, and then think through, what is causing it for whatever particular type of data you might be looking at.
Okay. Also somewhat related to the data, you briefly touched on this idea of baselining and separating event-driven demand out from baseline demand. Can you comment a little bit further on that? Like how, for example, could you keep track of baseline versus the building blocks, so to speak, like event-driven demand on top of that?
Okay, so as I said, the way that this is done is pretty complicated. I could potentially, the gist of the algorithm is almost a smoothing algorithm that looks at what has happened in non-promoted weeks historically and making some adjustments for the promotional week. So it's a complicated algorithm, and it's not something that I would actually recommend trying to implement on your own. So I guess the main point of going into that base demand thing is if there's not a straightforward way of separating those two different demand streams pretty surgically, really, so that it's just an accounting matter, that once you get into actually having to estimate something to separate out promotion and base demand, probably the best way to do that is through a model-based approach as opposed to a baselining algorithm.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears a little bit, can you provide some insights on how you might quantify a new event that does not have a historical basis? So for example, if you're looking out, a couple of years and you have a bunch of events, how would you quantify them in the forecast? And more specific to ForecasPRO, how might you adjust for that impact in the tool?
Well, okay, so an example of a new event might be just something like, again, my history is coming out of Nielsen, so a lot of my examples are kind of like CPG related, I guess, but running a 2-for-1. So suppose you had, always been running, 25% discounts on a regular basis, and you'd never tried a 2-for-1 type of promotion. So you don't know exactly what the lift is going to be, but you have a but you have run promotions in the past. So something like that, you would be able to say, okay, we expect this 2-for-1 to behave like this previous promotion, assign it an event type for that previous promotion, and generate the forecast like it is that previous promotion. And often that is going to be your best way of addressing it if you simply don't know how that impact is going to vary from other promotions that you've run in the past.
All right, and we'll wrap up with one last question, kind of also specific to ForecasPRO. Just FYI, once again, if we didn't get to yours, we'll be in touch shortly. But last question, can you discuss the difference between like outlier detection, which for those who aren't ForecasPRO users refers to more automatic detection and correction of outliers in the data, versus the event models that you discussed during today's webinar, and when you might use one versus the other?
Well, okay, so outliers, I typically think of things that you don't necessarily know what is driving it. So if you actually have an outlier and you know what's driving it, I would consider that to be an event. If it's something that has happened that is also definitely not going to happen in the future, it might be a viable thing to treat it as an outlier and somehow remove it and correct for it. But even if you do correct for it, if you had a big spike and you correct for it through outlier detection, that correction is still often going to be elevated a little bit, which would therefore argue that an event is probably going to make more sense. So they definitely, events are a good way of accommodating outliers, I would say. Outliers are not going to be a good way of accommodating events that happened. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining our webinar today. As Eric said, if there are any outstanding questions that we've not addressed, we will certainly make sure that we get back to you. So thank you for joining us today.